On the afternoon of August 17th, 1974, at the Boone County Fair in Lebanon, Indiana, in front of 2,400 people who had come to watch the open-class tractor pull, a farmer named Clem Rayfield trailered a 1933 Farmall F-20 into the staging area, and the whole fairground went quiet for a moment. Then people started laughing. Not mean laughter, the kind of laughter that comes when something happens that is so far outside the expected range that your brain defaults to humor before it gets around to understanding. A 41-year-old tractor at an open class pull in 1974, in a class that had 3 brand-new John Deere 4.32s, 2 International 1.466s, and a Case 1.47. Oh, that Harlan Pruitt had trailered from his dealership in Lebanon specifically because he planned to win the championship trophy for the 3rd year running. Harlan was the one who laughed loudest. He was standing near the staging area fence with 4 other men when Clem backed the Farmall off the trailer. Harlan watched it come down the ramp. The faded rust-orange paint, the bent fender, the exhaust stack that had a dent in it from 1963. And he laughed the way a man laughs when he is completely sure of something. "Clem," he called across the staging area, "is that thing going to make it to the start line?" Clem was unhooking the trailer tie-downs. He did not look up. "Because I can call a tow truck," Harlan continued, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "Save you the embarrassment of breaking down in front of everyone." A few people laughed. Someone near the fence said loud enough to carry, "Someone should tell him this is a tractor pull, not a museum exhibit." Clem finished unhooking the tie-downs. He climbed up on the Farmall and started it. The engine caught on the first pull of the hand crank and settled into a rumble that was not exactly what anyone expected from a 41-year-old tractor. It was deeper than it should have been, more resonant, like a sound coming from a larger space than the engine compartment suggested. But nobody paid attention to that. They were too busy pointing at the rust on the fenders. Clem drove the Farmall to the registration table without looking at Harlan. Let me tell you about Clem Rayfield, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he brought to that fairground. Clem was 44 years old in the summer of 1974. He had farmed 160 acres in Boone County his entire adult life, taking over from his father Virgil in 1968, when Virgil's health finally made the physical demands of farming impossible to meet. The farm was good ground, rolling Boone County soil that had been in the Rayfield family since Clem's grandfather settled it in 1901. Nothing about it was unusual. Nothing about it would have made you stop and look twice if you drove past it on the county road. What was unusual was the machine shed behind the red barn, specifically what Virgil Rayfield had been doing in that shed, under a single work lamp, on every evening and every weekend and every spare hour for 11 years, between 1957 and 1968. Let me tell you about Virgil Rayfield, because without Virgil, there is no story. Virgil had bought the 1933 Farmall F-20 new in the fall of 1933 for $875. It was the worst year of the Depression, and $875 was a sum that represented 3 years of careful saving and most of what he had. The bank would not lend against farm equipment that year. Nobody was lending against anything. Virgil had paid cash, the way his father had paid for everything and the way Virgil intended to pay for everything for the rest of his life. The Farmall had been a good tractor, not spectacular, not the most powerful in the county, but honest and reliable in the way that the best tools are honest and reliable. It did exactly what it was designed to do and asked for nothing except maintenance and respect. Virgil had given it both across 24 years of farming. By 1957, the tractor was 24 years old. It still ran. It still pulled, but the engine was wearing, the way engines wear across decades of hard use. The cylinder walls had developed enough clearance that compression was dropping. The power was not what it had been. A new tractor would have been the logical answer. Virgil had looked at the new John Deeres. He had sat in the seat of a new IH. He had talked to Harlan Pruitt's father about financing, and then he had gone home and done something different. Virgil Rayfield was not, by training or by any formal credential, a machinist. He was a farmer who had learned mechanical work from his father the way farm men learned it in that era, by necessity, by doing, by the specific education that comes from having no money, to pay someone else and no choice but to figure it out yourself. He could rebuild a carburetor, regrind valve seats, replace bearings, machine simple parts from stock in the shop. He was good at it. But what he was proposing to do with the Farmall's engine in 1957 went well beyond what any Boone County farmer had attempted on his own equipment. He had read about engine modifications. He had found a copy of a machinist's handbook in the Lebanon Public Library and read it 3 times. He had corresponded by letter with a retired international harvester engineer in Peoria who answered questions about the F-20 engine's design tolerances and where the limits of the block's strength lay. He had spent 2 winters doing calculations on paper at the kitchen table, working out what was possible without breaking what was already there. What he determined was this: the F-20 engine block was strong enough to handle a significant increase in displacement and compression if the work was done right. The factory had built it conservatively, the way manufacturers build engines for general farm use, leaving margin for abuse and poor maintenance. That margin, if you approached it carefully, was room for something more. Virgil pulled the engine in the fall of 1957. He set up a work area in the machine shed with a used mill and lathe he bought at an industrial auction in Indianapolis for $340. He ordered measuring tools from a catalog, the kind of precision instruments that most farm shops did not have. He started boring the cylinders. He did not rush. He measured everything 3 times. He ordered pistons from a specialty supplier in Chicago that made oversized replacements for agricultural engines. He machined his own connecting rod bearings when he could not source the specifications he wanted. He modified the intake manifold by hand, opening the ports, smoothing the passages, doing the kind of work that took time and patience and the willingness to redo something 4 times. Until it was right. He worked on the engine for 11 years, not 11 years of continuous work. He farmed the whole time. He raised Clem and his 2 younger sisters. He kept the farm running. But every evening when the day's work was done, and every weekend morning before the field work started, Virgil was in the machine shed under that work lamp, working on the engine. He never told anyone in detail what he was doing. If neighbors asked, he said he was rebuilding the old Farmall. That was true enough. He did not mention the boring bar, the custom pistons, the modified camshaft profile he had spent 8 months getting right through a process of trial and measurement and adjustment that a professional engine builder would have recognized as meticulous, and that a casual observer would have seen as a man tinkering with an old tractor. Virgil finished the engine in the spring of 1968, 3 weeks before his health finally forced him to hand a farm to Clem. He started it for the first time with the rebuilt engine on a Tuesday morning in April. Clem was there. Virgil turned the key, and the engine caught, and neither of them said anything for a while. The sound was different. Not dramatically different, not obviously different to anyone who had not been listening to that engine for 35 years. But Virgil had been listening to it for 35 years. He looked at Clem. "Remember what I showed you about the carburetor adjustment," he said. "It is sensitive now. Do not let anyone else touch it." "What did you do to it?" Clem asked. Virgil looked at the engine. "I built what it should have been from the start," he said. He walked back to the farmhouse. That was the longest explanation he ever gave. He died 6 months later. Clem farmed the 160 acres and maintained the Farmall the way Virgil had shown him, with the specific care that a machine receives when the person caring for it understands it has been built beyond its specifications. He ran it for field work when he needed it, kept it serviced, kept the carburetor adjusted the way Virgil had taught him. He entered it in the Boone County Fair tractor pull 6 years later. Not on an impulse, on a calculation. Clem was not an impulsive man. He had been watching the county pull for years, timing the pulls, noting the weights, doing the arithmetic in the evenings at the kitchen table the same way Virgil had done his calculations. He believed the engine Virgil had built could win. He had not told anyone that. He had just shown up. Now let me tell you about Harlan Pruitt, because you need to understand what he brought to that fairground. Harlan had taken over his father's John Deere dealership in Lebanon in 1965. He was good at the business, possibly better than his father had been, because he had a natural salesman's understanding of what people wanted to believe about themselves when they bought equipment. He understood that a farmer buying a new tractor was not just buying horsepower. He was buying the feeling of being the man with the best equipment on the road. Harlan sold that feeling as naturally as he sold the iron that carried it. He had won the Boone County Open Class tractor pull in 1972 and 1973 with his dealership's demonstration tractors. Not because winning the pull sold more tractors, though it probably did, but because Harlan Pruitt did not enter competitions he did not intend to win. He was the kind of man who kept score in everything and who arranged the circumstances of every competition as carefully as possible in his own favor before the starting signal was given. His entry for 1974 was a John Deere 432, the largest and most powerful tractor in his current lineup, with a 404 cubic inch engine producing 116 horsepower. He had gone over it personally with his service manager the week before the fair. It was in perfect condition. He had driven it to the fairground on its own wheels the morning of the pull, drawing a crowd along the county road the way new equipment always drew a crowd. He had looked at the registration list that morning and laughed at the names he recognized and dismissed the ones he did not. He had not recognized the name Rayfield. He had not known what machine the name was attached to. When Clem backed the 1933 Farmall off the trailer, Harlan had already decided the outcome. He was about to discover that deciding the outcome and determining it were different things. Let me pause here and tell you something about tractor pulls, because You cannot understand what happened next without understanding what a pull actually measures. A tractor pull is not a test of horsepower, not directly. It is a test of traction, weight transfer, torque delivery, and the specific combination of mechanical advantage that determines how far a machine can drag a weighted sled before the wheels spin out or the engine loads down past the point of forward progress. A heavier tractor has more traction than a lighter one, all else being equal, because more weight on the drive wheels means more grip on the track surface. But more weight also means more mass to move, which costs power. The optimal machine is one that puts its power down efficiently. Low wheel spin, high torque at low RPM, maximum mechanical advantage through the drivetrain. The 1933 Farmall F20 was, from the factory, a light tractor. Its original weight was around 3,400 pounds. The John Deere 432 weighed over 12,000 pounds with ballast. On a straight comparison of weight and horsepower, the Farmall had no business being on the same track as the modern machines. But Virgil's engine modification had done something that the weight numbers did not capture. He had not just increased power, he had changed the character of the power. The modified camshaft profile delivered torque at lower RPM than the factory spec. The increased displacement and compression produced a flatter torque curve, meaning the engine held its pulling force across a broader range of load conditions before it lost momentum. The carburetor modifications Virgil had made kept the fuel mixture optimal even when the engine was working at maximum load. What this meant, in practical terms, was that the Farmall pulled differently from the way its weight suggested it should. It gripped, loaded, and held, rather than spinning and losing. Under the right conditions on the right track surface, it could pull a distance that its statistics said was impossible. Clem knew this. He had done the arithmetic. He was not certain of winning. He was certain of surprising everyone. Let me tell you about the pull itself, because that afternoon in August is the reason this story is still told in Boone County 50 years later. The open class started at 2 in the afternoon. 14 tractors had registered. The pull format was simple. Each tractor hooked to the weighted sled and pulled it down the 300-foot track. The sled transferred weight forward as it moved, making it progressively heavier until the tractor either pulled at the full 300 feet for a full pull or stalled out short of the line. The first 6 tractors pulled respectable distances. 2 of the modern IH machines pulled full pulls in the lighter early rounds. Harlan's 4320 drew 4th position in the first round and pulled the full 300 feet easily, the big engine barely working at the weight level set for the opening round. Harlan stepped out of the cab afterward and acknowledged the applause with the ease of a man who expected applause. Clem drew 11th position. He had been sitting on the Farmall seat since the pull started, not watching the other tractors, watching the track surface. He was reading the dirt the way his father had taught him to read soil, looking for the places where it was firm and where it was loose, where the sled had packed it and where the other tractor's wheels had chewed it up. When his number was called, he drove the Farmall to the staging area. The announcer read from his clipboard, Clem Rayfield, Terhune, Indiana, 1933, Farmall F20. There was a moment of silence over the PA system as the announcer registered what he had just read. Then he repeated it. 1933, Farmall F-20. That would make this machine 41 years old, folks. The crowd's reaction was not unkind. It was the reaction of a crowd that has come to see a competition and has just been offered something interesting to watch for reasons that have nothing to do with who they expect to win. They leaned forward. They pointed at the old red tractor and its faded paint and its bent fender, and they watched to see what would happen. Harlan was at the fence. He had his arms resting on the top rail, and he was smiling the smile of a man who has already won and is watching the entertainment portion of the afternoon. Clem backed the Farmall up to the sled and hooked the drawbar. He checked the connection without hurrying. He sat back in the seat and put his hand on the throttle. He had been in this moment 1,000 times in his imagination over the past 6 years. In the evenings after the day's work, when he sat at the kitchen table and thought about what Virgil had built and what it could do, he was not nervous. He was simply ready. The flag dropped. Clem opened the throttle. The Farmall moved forward, and the chain went taut, and the sled started to move. The crowd was watching, with the mild interest of people expecting to see a short pull. Something to applaud politely before the real competition resumed. At 100 feet, they were paying more attention. At 150 feet, people who had been sitting down were standing up. At 200 feet, the fence area was crowded 3 and 4 people deep. The Farmall's engine was doing what Virgil had designed it to do, not screaming at high RPM the way the modern tractor screamed, working, a deep, steady pulling sound, the kind of sound an engine makes when it is operating in the part of its torque curve where it was built to live. The rear wheels were not spinning, they were gripping, the steel cleats biting into the packed track surface, finding purchase, driving through. At 250 feet, Harlan Pruitt's smile had changed. At 280 feet, the crowd was making enough noise that the announcer stopped talking. At 300 feet, Clem Rayfield and the 1933 Farmall F-20 crossed the full pull line. The sound from the grandstands was the kind of sound that county fairs remember for decades. People were not just clapping, they were shouting. They were pointing at the old red tractor and the lean, quiet man on it. They were telling the people next to them what they had just seen, trying to make it real by saying it out loud. Clem drove the Farmall back to the staging area. He did not wave. He did not raise his fist. He shut the engine down, climbed off the tractor, and began checking the rear wheel bearings for heat the way Virgil had taught him to do after any extended pull. The man next to him at the staging area, a farmer named Davis, who had pulled with a 1466, watched Clem crouch down beside the wheel hub and said, "Son, you just pulled a full pull with a 1933 Farmall. You could check those bearings later." Clem looked up at him. "If something went wrong with the bearings during the pull," he said, "I want to know about it now." He went back to checking. The finals started an hour later, with the weight on the sled increased by 1,200 pounds. 9 tractors had made the cut, including Harlan's 4320 and the 2 IH full pullers, and in a result that had the fairground talking about nothing else during the break, Clem's Farmall. Harlan pulled in the finals and got 267 feet before the big John Deere engine loaded past its traction limit and the rear tires began to spin. It was a good pull, a competitive pull, the kind of pull that wins most county fairs in most years. Clem pulled last. The crowd had grown at the fence line during the break, as word moved through the fairground. People who had been at the livestock barn and the midway had heard what happened in the first round and had come to see the second one. The flag dropped. Clem opened the throttle. The same sound, the same grip, the same steady forward movement that looked wrong to everyone watching because it was coming from a machine that the eye said should not be doing it. At 200 feet in the finals, with 1,200 additional pounds on the sled, the Farmall's rear wheels began to show their work. Clem could feel it in the way the machine sat. He adjusted his foot position, shifted his weight forward slightly. The small corrections of a man who knows his machine through every physical signal it sends. The wheels found grip again. At 260 feet, 3 of the 9 finalists had already stopped short of this mark. At 285 feet, the Farmall crossed where Harlan's pull had ended. At 300 feet, Clem crossed the full pull line for the second time. The crowd at the fence was 10 people deep. The grandstands were on their feet. The announcer had stopped reading from his clipboard entirely and was simply watching along with everyone else. The noise from 2,400 people in a county fairground in Indiana in August of 1974 was the loudest sound Clem Rayfield had ever heard in his life. He drove the Farmall back to the staging area and shut the engine down. He climbed off. He crouched down and checked the rear wheel bearings for heat. They were warm, but not hot. Virgil had built it right. If you want to know what Harlan Pruitt did when the results were posted, and what he said when he finally walked across the staging area to where Clem was standing, subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me if you have ever watched someone show up somewhere with something everyone dismissed and seen what happened when it performed. Harlan stood at the fence for a while after the results were posted. He had his arms at his sides and his hat in his hands, and he was looking at the 1933 Farmall, the way a man looks at something that has just changed the shape of what he thought he understood. The people around him had already moved on. They were talking about the pull, about the Farmall, about Clem, about what it meant. Harlan was standing still in the middle of all of that motion. He walked across the staging area. Clem was loading the Farmall back on the trailer, the same methodical process he had used to unload it that morning, the same without hurrying. He saw Harlan coming and kept working. Harlan stopped at the trailer ramp. He put his hat back on. He looked at the Farmall. "That engine," he said, "that is not a factory engine." "No," Clem said. He kept working. "How long did it take?" Clem stopped working and looked at Harlan. 11 years, he said. "My father, he started it in '57 and finished it the spring before he died." Harlan was quiet. He looked at the tractor. He walked around to the engine side and looked at the air cleaner, the carburetor, the exhaust manifold, reading the external evidence of what was underneath. He was a man who understood engines. He was reading the story of Virgil's work in the parts he could see. "What displacement is it running?" Harlan asked. Clem told him. Harlan exhaled slowly. "That is not supposed to fit in that block." "My father disagreed," Clem said. Harlan walked back to the trailer ramp and stood there. He was the kind of man who never apologized for anything, not because he lacked the character, but because he had never before been in a situation where he felt the weight of a specific wrong that needed specific acknowledgement. He was in one now. "I said some things this morning," Harlan said. "When you unloaded?" "I heard them," Clem said. "They were wrong." Harlan looked at Clem. "I was wrong." Clem looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the tractor. My father spent 11 years in the machine shed after everyone told him a 1933 Farmall was a worn-out piece of junk, not worth the time it would take to fix it. He paused. You were not the first man to say that. You were just the first one to say it in front of 2,400 people. Harlan nodded. He deserved that. He did not argue. Clem finished loading the trailer. He tied the chains, checked the ramp, walked to his truck. "Mr. Pruitt," he said before he got in, "my father used to say that a man who builds something nobody believes in has already won the argument. He just has to wait for the right day to show it." He got in the truck and drove back to Terhune. Let me tell you about what happened afterward, because this story does not end at the fairground. The Boone County Fair tractor pull results ran in the Lebanon Reporter the following Thursday. The headline on the agricultural page read, "Antique Farmall wins open class pull." The story was 3 paragraphs long and was accurate in its facts and completely unable to convey what had actually happened in the fairground that August afternoon. Facts rarely can. But word in Boone County did not depend on the newspaper. It spread the way word always spread in farming communities, at the feed store and the co-op and the diner and the church parking lot. By the end of August, everyone in the county knew the story. By the end of September, farmers from 3 neighboring counties had heard it. By the end of the year, a machinist in Terre Haute, who specialized in agricultural engine work, had written Clem a letter asking if he could see the Farmall's engine. Clem wrote back and said yes. The machinist drove to Terhune on a Saturday in November and spent 4 hours in the machine shed with the engine torn down on the workbench. He did not say much while he was working. When he was done, he sat on the workbench and looked at Clem. "I have been building engines for 30 years, he said. "I have never seen this approach to the camshaft profile. Your father developed this himself?" "From a machinist's handbook and 11 years of trial," Clem said. The machinist shook his head slowly. He looked at the camshaft. "This is not amateur work," he said. "This is the work of a man who understood what he was trying to achieve and had the patience to get there." He paused. "What did your father do before farming?" "He farmed," Clem said. The machinist looked at the engine for a long time. Then he looked at Clem. "Can I make drawings of this?" Clem said yes. The machinist spent another 2 hours making careful drawings of every modified component. He said goodbye, thanked Clem, drove back to Terre Haute. 6 months later, he sent Clem a copy of a paper he had presented at a small engine modification symposium in Indianapolis. The paper described a camshaft profile and carburetor modification approach for agricultural engines that produced unusually flat torque curves and efficient power delivery at low RPM. The paper cited the source of the approach as a farmer in Boone County, who had developed it independently over 11 years of shop work. The paper named Virgil Rayfield. Clem read the paper twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the same fireproof box where he kept the farm deed and Virgil's original engine calculations. He entered the Farmall in the Boone County Fair tractor pull again in 1975 and 1976. He won both years. By 1977, 3 other competitors had arrived at the staging area with tractors that showed evidence of serious internal engine work, trying to replicate whatever the Rayfield Farmall was doing. None of them got close to what Virgil had built across 11 years because what Virgil had built was not just a set of modifications. It was the accumulated result of 11 years of learning, adjusting, and understanding a specific engine so completely that the modifications in the machine had become the same thing. Harlan Pruitt entered the pool in 1975 with a different strategy. He came with a 4430, larger than the 4320, and he had hired an engine shop in Indianapolis to do work on it. He pulled 283 feet in the open class finals. Clem pulled a full 300. Harlan drove home, and for the first time in his dealership career, did not display the county pull trophy in his showroom window because he did not have it. He and Clem were not friends after 1974, but they were something, some specific category of mutual respect between men who have tested each other publicly and know exactly where the other one stands. When they passed on the county road, they waved. When they met at the co-op, they talked. When Harlan's service manager had a question about a vintage engine he could not figure out, Harlan sent him to Clem. Clem never charged for his time. He figured Virgil would have said the same thing. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is the thing Virgil would have wanted you to know. The 1933 Farmall F-20 is still in the machine shed at the Rayfield farm. Clem's son Robert farms the 160 acres now and maintains the tractor, the way Clem maintained it and Virgil maintained it before him. Robert enters it in the antique class at the Boone County Fair every year, not the open class, because Robert believes the tractor has earned the right to compete in a class where it is not expected to lose in order to make a point. It wins the antique class every year, not because it is the newest or the most polished, because it is the most thoroughly understood machine in whatever class it enters, built to a standard that nobody looking at it from the outside can read from the paint and the rust. Virgil Rayfield never won a trophy in his life. He spent 11 years in a machine shed after dark building an engine that no one believed was worth building for a competition he was not alive to see. He died 6 months after he heard it run for the first time with the rebuilt engine in the spring of 1968 in the farmhouse where he had been born. He heard it run. He saw Clem's face when he heard it. He told Clem what to do about the carburetor. Then he walked back to the farmhouse. He knew what he had built. He did not need a trophy to confirm it. He did not need anyone at a county fair to applaud it. He had done what he set out to do, which was take a machine everyone called junk and make it into something they could not explain. That is the story of the 1933 Farmall and the 11 years in the machine shed and the August afternoon when 2,400 people in a county fairground found out what a farmer can build when he has a machine, a machinist's handbook, and enough evenings to figure it out. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories about the men who built what nobody believed, who worked in the machine shed after dark when the day's work was done, who never told anyone what they were doing because the work was its own justification, and the day would come when the work would speak for itself. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, is there a machine in your family's history that someone built or kept or restored when everyone else said it was not worth the time? I want to hear that story. The Farmall is still in the shed. The engine Virgil built is still in the block. It still runs. It still sounds the way it sounded on that Tuesday morning in April of 1968 when Virgil started it for the first time, and neither he nor Clem said anything for a while. Some things do not need to be explained. They just need to be heard.